Hello to everybody that's joining. I can see that most of you are still connecting to audio. Welcome to the Festival of Trusteeship. It's been going for 2 days now. We're slap bang in the middle of our second day. This is the second of 4 sessions on day 2. You should be able to see a housekeeping slide. For those of you that have been to some of the other sessions, the housekeeping rules are still the same. For those of you where it's potentially your first one, first of all, thank you for joining. Just so you know, the session is being recorded. We've already hit the record button, and you will get access to the recording and any slides that are used following the session. If you're a weekly pass holder, you will get all the recordings for all the sessions in one block on Friday. Please stay muted on the call unless asked to unmute. It helps to make sure that everyone can hear who is talking clearly. Closed captions are available, but you'll need to enable these from your side by using the Zoom control bar. Do use the chat function to ask questions and share your experiences. The chat is also recorded, so you will get a version of the chat, although you can also download it yourself if you wish to. That's useful because people share lots of email addresses, hyperlinks, etc. that you might want to include for yourself. We will always read out questions fully from the chat, and as I said, the chat is included in the recording, so please only put things that you want to be in writing forever. We are holding networking sessions at the end of today, tomorrow and Thursday. You asked for more of those in former festivals, and so we've put them in, some structured time for people to connect, because that's typically what happens in the middle of these sessions. And then the last 2 bits from me are thank you to our media partner, Third Sector, and to Ecclesiastical, because their support has meant that the maximum cost for an event is just £5, with many free sessions, including all of our aspiring trustee strands. So without further ado, I'd just like to invite Faith from Ecclesiastical to come off mute and do an introduction. Thanks.
Hi, thanks Leon, and good afternoon everyone. My name is Faith Kitchen. I'm representing Ecclesiastical today. We're honoured to be sponsoring the Festival of Trusteeship again this year. As an award-winning specialist insurer and risk management partner for Charities, we're very committed to the sector and have been now for over 135 years. We support the sector not only with our specialist expertise, but also with our expert knowledge in the sector through our research. And I know some of it was shared on the earlier session earlier today. We've done some specific research for the festival around trusteeship, which will be shared in various sessions throughout the week. We've also just launched our Charity Risk Barometer report as well, which I would definitely recommend checking out. It includes all of our latest research. We surveyed over 250 charities in the UK, and this can be found on our website. But it was also published by Third Sector last week. You may also be aware, or you may not, that Ecclesiastical Insurance is part of the Benefact Group. And this is a group of specialist financial services. We give all of our available profits back to good causes. So we're the 3rd largest corporate donor in the UK at the moment, with aspirations to reach #1. The reason I'm telling you that is because obviously the audience of charities, we run a programme of giving throughout the year. And any charity, any UK, Irish charity, KIC or non-profit can apply for a grant through the Movement for Good Awards, which is on the Benefact Group website at any time of year. So you can apply for £1,000, and at certain times of years for a much larger grant up to £100,000 as well. But also this week we have a special draw for £5,000 for any charities that are involved with children or young people. So if that's you, please do go along and apply. It's a very easy process. So we very much hope you enjoy the Festival of Trusteeship and of course today's session. Thank you very much, Leon.
Thanks, Faith, and straight over to Ambreen, who is chairing the session. Ambreen.
Thanks, Leon. Welcome everyone to today's session, and hope you're going to find this an enjoyable and interesting discussion about the role of grant makers, the role that grant makers can have around increasing board diversity, their own, but also of the people that they fund. We've got a great panel lined up for you, but before I ask them to introduce themselves, Penny, I'm going to ask you to launch the poll because I guess we were quite keen to understand who is sitting in the audience today. So if you want to, while you press the button as to who you are, I'm going to ask each of our panelists just to introduce themselves very briefly. Paul, can I start with you?
Sure. Hi, I'm Paul Streets. I'm the Chief Exec of the Lloyds Bank Foundation for England and Wales. For those who don't know, we fund small local charities, about 600 around the country, around England and Wales. And we also, alongside that, do advocacy work around issues that rise from that. And we do some work around root causes. I've worked in the sector a long time with loads and loads of boards, and I'm a bit of a fan of working with boards. So look forward to speaking later.
Thanks, Paul. Catherine?
Hi everybody, I'm Catherine Seymour, Director of Policy, Practice and Research at the Association of Charitable Foundations. We are the membership body for trusts and foundations. We've got 450 members across corporate, family, community foundations, foundations with endowments, foundations without endowments, huge variety in our membership. I'm also a trustee for 2 charities. I'm a trustee for the Running Charity, which works with young people who are experiencing homelessness, and I'm co-treasurer for my children's school PTA, which is a registered charity as well. I've worked in the voluntary sector since 2017, but I am new to the world of funders. So I joined ACF earlier this year, and a lot of what I'll have to offer today is from some of the great practice that I've seen from our members.
Thanks, Catherine. Abid.
Assalamu alaikum everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Abid. I'm Director of Diversity at Arts Council England. We're the National Development Agency for Culture and Creativity, supporting organisations around the country. I'm a former trustee, so not active trusteeships at the moment, but we do a lot of work with boards and governing bodies of our funded organisations.
Thanks, Abid. George.
Yeah. I'm George Amafidon, one of the trustees from the Co-op Foundation. The foundation is essentially Co-op's charity that is all around building communities of the future together. For a living personally, I lead an organization called Motives that upskills thousands of underserved young people to access STEM jobs and become change makers. And the other half of my kind of job is as a race engineer with Sir Lewis Hamilton's electric racing team, shaping the future of sustainable motorsport.
Thanks, George. And just a little bit about me. I'm an associate of Getting on Board, but have been a trustee now for a couple of years. And one of those is actually a grant making organisation. But I've worked in the grant making world for more than 20 years now, so know it well. Now, having worked there for about 20 years, it's clear to me that there are obviously clearly some good examples of where boards are being diversified within grant makers. But as the data, however dated it is, tells us there is clearly some way to go. So one of the first questions that we were going to discuss was, why are boards of grant-making charities just less representative of the society that we live with? And why does this matter? So, Paul, can I get you to share your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose we're in a fortunate position, and we're not typical in that we recruit our board openly. We're not endowed. We're not a family foundation. So I do recognise that there are issues for family foundations in particular, in terms of diversity, because they tend to look within the family. But I think as a sector, as a foundation sector, we really have to step up to this, because we are trying to reach organisations that ought to be led by and for the communities we serve. And if we're going to do that effectively, we need to look like they look like our side of the table. And the reason for that, I mean, the wrong reason is because of representation. We always think we must have somebody who's representative. I think it's because it really genuinely changes the way you approach issues and questions. It really has changed the way that we think about lived experience. It's really changed things like our approach towards faith-based organisations and how we reach particular communities in terms of from an inclusion perspective. It's changed the way that we think about things like interest and whether Muslim charities will apply to us. We wouldn't have had those insights if we hadn't had people on the board who come from and understand those communities. And for us, it's really moved from a debate from diversity to one of inclusion. So for me, it's pretty fundamental. And even if you're a family foundation where you may have a number of members of the family on the board, I think you really need to think through why you're doing this and actively seek to have a board that better looks like the communities that you're trying to reach. Because otherwise, I think you're going to really struggle to understand how to reach them.
Thanks, Paul. Abid.
Thank you, Ambryn. The first thing I did just before coming onto this call was just to kind of check the data for our own governing body, because I think in the spirit of transparency, just to kind of share some data on how we're performing. And I think what's quite interesting is picking up on the point that Paul raised. We have a slightly different structure in terms of recruitment. So there's the role we play in attracting trustees directly to the Arts Council, whether you serve on our area councils. We work with the DCMS, the Department for Culture, Media and Sport, for National Council appointments. And then we also have a relationship with the Mayor of London when it comes to our London Area Council. So there's three very different parties involved, but just a little bit of headline data to kick things off. For our National Council, which oversees our work nationally, 20% of our National Council members are from a Black, Asian or ethnically diverse background, but only 6% would define as disabled. The picture is very different for our area councils, where we have more autonomy in terms of our recruitment. So 32% of our area council members are Black, Asian or ethnically diverse, and that also jumps up to 21% for disabled representation. So I think that's an important kind of benchmark to put out there. And one of the things we do is we do annual publications that kind of talk about the work that we're doing, where we are and how the sector's performing, but I'll come on to that a bit later. But at the heart of our work, I guess, is making sure diversity is at the heart of that DNA when we came to developing our 10-year strategy, Let's Create. We've taken a very active approach to recruitment, and I think we've recognized the importance of welcoming different perspectives. So it's kind of recognizing lived experience and experience of working in communities or working in an arts organization is just as important as those functional skills that we're often looking for, whether it's legal, accounting, etc. So that's something which is really important. We've done a lot of work around pipeline development. So we set up a youth advisory group, recognizing we wanted more younger people to be interested in governance. And we've also developed a pilot in our North area where we recognized we wanted to bring more disabled and ethnically diverse trustees on board. So we created an associate scheme, which gave people an opportunity to get insight and attend meetings before they became formal members, just to really get a sense of the work that we do as an organization. Interestingly, over the last 3 years, we've also set up a race advisory group and a disability advisory group. And that's been really pivotal in terms of amplifying the voice of diverse members on our council. And it also allows people who serve on different councils across different areas to come together. And I think those groups have been incredibly influential, but it's also created a space where people can talk to peers, where they're not the only person that might be from a particular background. So I think that's really important. I guess the last reflection I want to share at this stage is the idea of recruitment and retention. So I think recruitment's all about attraction. How do you make an opportunity attractive? I can only speak personally. Over the last 3 or 4 years, I've probably been inundated with requests from headhunters, search firms, looking for more diverse representatives on their boards. Some of those opportunities are more attractive than others. So I think there's something around actually feeling like you're being approached because of your skills and expertise, not simply because you happen to be ethnically diverse, female or disabled, for example. And I think the real work starts around retention, and that's more about belonging. So when you bring somebody on board, how do you make sure you create an environment? How do you ensure the culture of that board is welcoming? Because when you do invite someone who might have a different perspective, they might challenge, they might have a different viewpoint. And I think it's really important that when we're onboarding new board members, how do we make sure their voice is heard, their voice is amplified, and that they feel confident to be able to share their perspectives?
Thanks, Abid. And one of the questions that I guess one of the questions that comes to my mind as you're speaking is, you've clearly done a lot. Is it making a difference? Is it changing the conversations you're having? Is it making a difference to your grant making?
Yes, because again, what we've done is kind of set a range of equality objectives. So our first equality objective as an organization, and this kind of comes back to making sure diversity is part of the DNA of an organization, is we set an equality objective to make sure we can be more equitable in our distribution of funding. So when we look at what happened to our regular funding in 2018 to 23 versus what we've achieved in 23-26, we have made significant progress. There's still a lot more work to do, But I would say a significant part of that has been the challenge provided by those diverse members of our area councils and national councils, because they have ultimate responsibility around the decisions we make. And I think they were involved in both shaping the application process, looking at the applications that came in, and also challenging the executive in terms of what our ambition should be in terms of actually making sure our funding was reaching organisations that have historically either not been funded or have been underfunded. So yeah, they've played a very key role in shifting the dial on our investment too.
Brilliant, thanks, Abid. George, I know that just thinking about what Abid said in terms of belonging, I know that you're one of the younger, or you were one of the younger trustees, but your reflections.
Sure, thank you. In terms of my kind of answer to your question, which is why are boards of kind of grant-making charities less representative of society and why it matters, my kind of initial statement, and if this is the only statement you take away, then so be it, is if you're not on the table, then you're on the menu, right? So it's always the case and it's never changed. So it has to be representative of the people that you're serving in every way, looking at all the intersections, as Paul kind of mentioned. In my experience, kind of being on the Co-op Foundation, I joined just over 2 years ago. And that was kind of with a mission to, fund as many young people as we could from communities to help them reach their potential. That was kind of the initial kind of thought process I went in with. And today they funded over 19 million to over 300 organizations across the UK. And I was fortunate enough to join on this retention piece that Abid mentioned when they were just adjusting their strategy. So they were kind of refreshing it and looking for something new. And that is actually a key pivotal point that hopefully we can speak about later. But that essentially allowed me to feel part of that process. And, everything that was being suggested, I could actually help to shape the future of the foundation. And kind of since then, I've been able to be involved in everything that the trustees have kind of engaged in, different funds around climate change, impacting many different young people. And most recently, within that new strategy, we released something called the Future Communities Fund, which essentially is kind of a case study, in my view, that offers the flexible grants of up to 30K to different organizations that are helping diverse young people to develop the skills to become future leaders. Now, this is key because we could essentially help to drive that and say, what is the need in the sector? What aren't they getting at the moment? And how can we essentially pilot something to move that forward, right? So I think being at that table has essentially allowed me to give a voice to people that may feel unseen and fund causes that, we need most. So I think that's why we need it. And just a little bit more about the Future Communities kind of fund or collective. It's essentially an initiative that is all around how we can foster that, cooperation. And it takes these young people, puts them in, essentially gives them power or allows them to use their power. And we kind of worked with a youth development agency to bring this collective together so that they could focus on where that funding actually goes, making sure that we develop the work to align with our strategic kind of priorities and communications as well. So yeah, it really just essentially delegated a lot of the power that we had as trustees. And because, we're still trying to work on all elements of diversity within the team and also at the governance level, ensure that they're part of that process. So essentially, there's just never a reason why, even if it is less representative in terms of your board, that you can't make a difference. But we understand why it matters. So we thought we need to get them involved, even because youth boards a lot of times aren't equitable. Even if you put someone, just to come and oversee, it's great, it looks good, it sounds good, but realistically, the same people are getting the funding. So it's like, how can you give them the influence over the decisions? And that's what we did. And that is a bit scary, I'll be honest. But, we saw the results and they were kind of, the impact is going to be huge. And we're still going through that pilot, but it was great to kind of go through that process. And the team was amazing in doing that.
It sounds like a key from both you and Abid in particular has said that you started with strategy is key. So actually having it embedded within your strategy, so it infiltrates, I guess, the culture, the business as usual, everything that you're doing. And I guess, shifting power, real power, and delegating that so that people really genuinely have influence over decision making. So, Catherine, I know that you, as a membership body, have that oversight of a range of foundations, and given the diversity of foundations that exist in the UK, I wonder how much of that you're seeing and where you think some of the barriers might be in making that shift in terms of governance for foundations.
Thanks, Ambreen. And I really like that the question you posed originally it rests on the data, because for me a big barrier is the lack of data in this. And the most recent data we have about trustee diversity, which is from some work that ACF funded, is from 2018, and that's nearly 6 years ago. It was a snapshot data, based on a sample. It was a snapshot, and since then there hasn't been any comprehensive data analysis. And I think what we need is something that is comprehensive, it's regular. We can look at that data on trustee diversity cut by type of organisation, so we can see funders separately, types of funders, size of organisation and geography. And for something that's as serious as this, we know that the funder sector is less diverse in terms of board diversity than the wider voluntary sector, and we know that the wider voluntary sector is less diverse than the public sector or the private sector. So when it's this important and we don't have that data, that's a real barrier for me. And we know that things, or we hope that things have got slightly better since that data in 2018, but without knowing it, we don't know that it's got better, and we also can't see perhaps what efforts have led to improvements. So being able to track in particular years, this effort has then led to this improvement, really helps us to be able to recognise where there's been some improvements as well. So data is definitely a big part of a big barrier and a big part of the solution. But for me, on that data point, there's a real action for funders to take, because any data analysis is hampered by how the Charity Commission collects and holds data about trustees. So funders letting the Charity Commission know how important this is, funding work to do the analysis, sharing those findings, and demonstrating action as a result of those findings. Those are all quite tangible actions for foundations and funders to do. And then coming back to the question about why the funder sector is less diverse, I think it's important to note that it's not an even picture. There's lots of variety, and there's some foundations who are highly diverse and have put a lot of effort into this and are doing fantastically. But of course, when we look at the data from 6 years ago and see that 99% of trustee boards in foundations are white, we know that that's not representative of the sector. There are around 10,000 foundations in the UK. Lots of those are very, very small, and that does make a difference in terms of diversity. A lot of those foundations might have just a couple of trustees. The Charity Commission says best practice is somewhere between 5 and 12 trustees, depending on the size of your organisation. But even for a small organisation, and 5 trustees is best practice. So the fewer trustees you have, the harder it is to strike that balance and have that kind of diversity. I think also for smaller organisations with fewer trustees, it's more difficult for trustees or they're less likely to come along to an event like this. They're less likely to see what the best practice is and be able to tap into that best practice and apply that to their own foundation. So there are definitely, it is harder to be diverse when you're smaller. I wanted also to pick up on a point that Paul mentioned about family foundations, and family foundations do face particular barriers with achieving diversity in their board. So it feels important to reference family foundations in this conversation. Some of those foundations were restricted to family members only and how they recruit to their board, and that's written into their governing documents. That doesn't mean that can never change. We certainly know of family foundations who are ACF members who are changing their governing documents so that they can recruit outside family members, and those who haven't got to that stage yet, are looking at using or actively using board committees for decision-making purposes. So where there's no such restrictions on family members only in those committees, actually ensuring that those committees are diverse and that that's where a lot of the decision-making of the organisation takes place.
Thanks, Catherine. I don't know if any of the other panelists wanted to come back on any of that in terms of George.
It was just actually a quick one. I think there was some mention in the chat, and it's been spoken about a few times in terms of the recruitment side. So I think that is key. And if you speak to the family foundations or whatever foundation it might be, that often might be small and focused on a particular remit, for example, if they just rely on their network, you know, to your question, I'm not understanding how they can necessarily be representative of society a lot of times, unless they are, you know, representative, their organization or their, you know, for example, let's say you were trying to address something in inner city London and you're a Black-led organization, for example, like mine, I can perhaps have something representative, but if they've decided, okay, I want to tackle this and they don't necessarily have the network, then that is a bit of a challenge, especially at the recruitment stage. So using the organizations that are performing well, it's also amplifying those that are. So for me, I joined the Co-op Foundation through Starfish, and it's finding those organizations that are doing a great job, and that is potentially a lever as well. But yeah, I think it definitely, you know, requires on finding that pool of talent that you can also get the best people from to support your causes as well.
I know Penny's always saying how a lot of recruitment still is a tap on the shoulder, and actually open recruitment is a key, is a fundamental key to diversity. Paul, I know you wanted to come in.
Yeah, I wanted to come back to purpose really, because I don't think we have a choice in this really. So for us, I think funders are in such a powerful position. We have this enormous power in order to act like God almost, deciding who gets money and who doesn't get money. And many of us think we're doing it fine because we're all well-meaning, mostly liberal people who run foundations and working foundations. When we looked at the data, so we're a social justice fund effectively. When we looked at the data from Black Lives Matter, we realized there were whole communities we were simply not reaching, particularly Black, Asian, ethnic minority communities, disabled communities. And we had to ask ourselves why. And I think the why was because we were simply not thinking about the barriers they were facing. And I think unless you have people right at the center of decision-making, you understand what it's like to be a disabled person living in Britain today, what it's like to be from a Black or an Asian community in Britain today, you're simply not going to be able to reach the people you want to reach. So I think there's partly, and power starts with trustees, doesn't it? Unless we properly reflect that, and I say this as a white leader, for me, this has been a real road to Damascus. I've had to fundamentally rethink a lot of the ways I behave. I've had to think a lot about inclusion. That would not have happened had we not had COVID. It's a tragedy that we had to have COVID. It gave us the wake-up call that said, actually, you're just not reaching people. You have to rethink what you're doing, rethink how you're designing your processes, rethink how you're designing your grant making. And we've had to do that and ask some quite soul-searching questions about what we thought was a very good grant maker 3 or 4 years ago to where we are now. And it's still a journey. We're still learning all the time and being challenged around it. You have to be really open to that. If you're a bunch of white liberals sitting around a table, frankly, you're simply not going to be able to get that kind of thinking because you don't have that experience. So I don't think it's an option for us if we're going to be effective. It may be different in some sectors. I don't know. I can't even see why it's different in culture, actually. But certainly if you're in the social justice space that many foundations are, this is an imperative. It's not an option. You have to look at the power and who's making decisions right at the center, and that starts with the board.
Thanks. Before I move us on to thinking about, so we've talked a little bit about internally and why it's important, and clearly it is making a difference to the decisions that are being made within foundations when your governance and your governance leadership is diverse. But I was just going to refer, some of you might have seen it in the chat, but in the poll right at the beginning, we asked who's in the room. So just for everyone, just in case you haven't seen it, 14% are aspiring trustees, 45% current trustees, 18% charity managers, and then half of you are someone who works with a trustee. So bearing that in your mind, I guess, I've asked each of you to think about 2 levers, because obviously grant makers not only need to look inwards, but also have the power, well, you just talked about the power that grant makers have to really influence and create behaviour change within the charities that they fund. So I guess if I was to ask you what are sort of 2 key things that you've either done or that you think funders could do to support the charitable sector to be even more diverse in their governance, because clearly there is still a huge skew towards certain types of people in those leadership roles. So Abid, do you want to come in first on this one?
Thank you. My apologies. My computer completely shut down on me, and you just
Thank you for rejoining.
But just on this question, I think there's two things from an Arts Council perspective. I think the two things I want to talk about are funding agreements with the organisations we fund, and then the power of publishing data. I think funding agreements are key, and they're the connection you have back to your strategy, back to the programs that you develop in terms of what the aims and aspirations are. When we launched our Let's Create strategy, we developed our new inclusivity and relevance investment principle. And I guess there's three key pillars to that. How does the programming, arts and cultural organisations put on reflect the diversity of contemporary England? How are we reaching the communities across England? And that's more than just the audiences that come. Sometimes we have to ask who isn't in the audience, and to build that relationship, you might have to go into a community setting rather than within the venue that you operate. And the thing that's really pertinent to today's conversation is, how does the workforce leadership and governance reflect wider society? One learning for us when it came to developing the inclusivity and relevance principle was that that journey won't look the same across the country. So if you are an organisation based in London, your aspiration and our expectations of you will be very different when it comes to race, for example, compared to an organisation that might be based in Cornwall. So I think it's recognising you need that baseline data on your local communities where an organisation is, sometimes even within a particular art form or discipline. So the challenges facing contemporary music will be very different to classical music or opera. So you need to recognize that each organization is at a different starting point. So what we asked organizations to do when they applied for regular funding is to set a baseline. So tell us where you are currently in terms of diversity, and we capture data on age, sex, race, disability, sexual orientation, and socioeconomic background. We then want organizations to think about what the population looks like within their local communities and to set targets. How you meet those targets should be owned by the board. So I think it's not just a case of diversifying the board, but it's also kind of saying the board is the accountable body that should hold the executive or the leadership team to account. And what we then do is have regular monitoring throughout the year or throughout the funding agreement. And if organizations are falling behind, we can reflect that in the risk rating organizations have. The second element is publishing data. So I think for the last 7 or 8 years, we've published an annual report on diversity that includes data on ourselves as an organization. So if we're behind the curve, we're quite transparent around publishing our own workforce leadership and governance data, but we also do it for the organizations that we fund. We take it one step further for those larger organizations. So if you're an organization that gets regular funding from the Arts Council and you employ 50 or more people, we break down that data on an individual basis for that organization, for the board, and for senior leadership across a range of protected characteristics. And that's really important because I think that introduces transparency. I think it also kind of makes organizations more aware that their communities can see the progress they're making or the lack of progress they're making. And it also kind of touches upon your public reputation as an organization. So I think when you put data in the public domain, organizations need to be able to have a narrative in terms of what they're doing to shift the dial. So I think they're the two things that we've really begun to try and focus on. And underpinning all of that is an offer of support. So on our website, we have a range of toolkits, resources that organizations and boards can access to support them with that ambition.
Thanks, Abid. And I know that is making a difference because I've spoken to organisations that have gone, oh, we've got a particular eye on this because the Arts Council have asked us to account for ourselves. But I'm right in thinking that you're not just doing protected characteristics, because you talked about socioeconomic background as well, for example.
Yeah, socioeconomic is something that we really believed in, and I think you've made a really good point there, Ambryn. When I talk to the sector, I don't want people to do something because their funder asks them to do it, and I don't want them to do it because the law requires them to do it. And if an organisation doesn't believe in it, then it just feels very superficial. And I think coming back to some of the points that Paul and George made earlier, you'll be found out very quickly if you're not building it into the core values and mission of how you do things. So I think funders have a role to encourage it, but I'd be disappointed if somebody said we only have a diversity strategy or we're doing this because you asked us to do it. That isn't the right reason to be doing it.
George.
I was just reading something in the chat, which I agree with. But in terms of the levers, in our case at the Co-op Foundation, one of the things which is very close to home is actually financial support for trustee diversity initiatives. I guess the foundation provides some funding to organizations like Getting on Board, also the Young Trustees movement, and that is kind of part of our package to build fairer communities, essentially. So I think that is key to actually fund those initiatives that are trying to do that, because truth is it's very difficult to do everything, but you can definitely put some resources behind that if you actually believe in it, alongside, of course, just recruiting the diverse trustees yourself, because that speaks volumes. Another one that I would say is around diversity awareness and support networks, roughly. And the reason why I say that is because a lot of people don't necessarily know that they can become trustees. Their boiler is broken. They're not thinking about, oh, maybe I can advocate for other people that also are in a similar position. They're just focused on, they're very much their needs here and now, and they're not thinking about anything at that governance level. So I think it's actually, making that aware, and we've, funded some people as well in order to basically kind of understand what that can look like. And that sometimes is, work on social media, for example, for those aspiring trustees, for example, that are here, to encourage them and motivate them to actually take, these positions on. Last one would probably be around the research and campaigns, which I think kind of builds on Catherine's point in some way, in terms of the data side, because if we don't have that data, it's very difficult to do anything actionable.
Thanks, George. I know I just got to mention that some of you might have been at the Charity Commission event yesterday, and on data, they're very aware that the data that we have on board diversity at grant making level is dated now. And I guess we didn't quite get a commitment to doing another report, but a commitment that recognises that in due course, I guess their ambitions for their digital platforms around each trustee having a personal account, and therefore being able to record that data, that hopefully we will in time have this data more at our fingertips, but it doesn't look like we're going to get it anytime soon, I don't think. Paul, do you want to come on in?
Yeah, I'm looking at the chat actually. Diversity, Paul, does not mean, Paul Miles, does not mean white males over the age of 62 on the board. It absolutely does not. We just cannot accept that. Actually, we have massive levers, because we can decide who we're going to fund and not fund. We're gods, aren't we, in the foundation world, fundamentally? So that's a really important lever. And as a consequence of what we learned, to our own shame, really, through COVID, we've created 2 programs, one based on race equity, one based on deaf disabled people's organizations. We require that the majority of trustees are from those communities, or we won't fund you. It's as straightforward as that. So that's a really direct lever. And I think, the point for me is, I think it's George's point actually too, is it's much easier for us to provide back office support to strengthen an organization with the right people around the board than it is to make sure the right people are around the board in the first place. So we can provide a whole suite of support around organization development, which we do. Finance, social media, all that kind of stuff, some of the stuff the Core Foundation do. It's fundamental to who we are. I think we need to completely rethink our approach towards risk For example, looking at single faith organizations and recognizing that to reach some communities, we have to work with single faith organizations, Muslim charities, charities that reach Black communities that are part of the evangelical and Pentecostal services. It's the only way we'll reach some of those communities. So we have to think about some of those things like that. We have to think about related parties, because related parties, we basically in Britain have a ethnographic white governance model that assumes that organizations ought to be governed in a particular way that plays to British society as it was 100 years ago, not British society is now. So we need to fundamentally rethink risk. And that means actually by doing this as a foundation, you need then to think about how you can support some of those risks, not rule somebody out because maybe they've got some related parties around the table. I do think, and this is really a pause for me, actually, I do think in terms of disability organizations, we need to think about potentially whether we should be paying trustees, because it's a big issue if you're in a learning disability community. How do we get those people? Now, that is a shibboleth for me, because I've always thought central to the voluntary sector is the volunteer as a trustee. And fundamentally, I think that's right. But I do think we have to examine some of those sacred cows if we're going to reach these kinds of communities. We've got to rethink how we approach these organizations if we're going to reach them. And we need to look at our own data. I mean, George and Catherine are right. It's really hard to actually extract it as to who is on trustee boards when you look at them. But by requiring half of them to be from those communities, we then begin to have a very different conversation. And we are funding really different kinds of organizations, reaching different kinds of people with different sets of risks that we are having to adapt. And the question is, how do we change? Not how they change so they can fit our white ethnocentric governance model, which is where we are at the moment.
Thank you, Paul. So, Catherine, I guess, again, having that oversight of the foundation world, I wonder what you would say in terms of what some of the levers you've seen are being put into place, recognising what Paul's just said.
Thanks, Amber. Yeah, I mean, yeah, lots that I've heard I agree with. Three points or perspectives perhaps that I wanted to offer. The first, in terms of the role that foundations have to influence organisations they support and fund, and also influence across the foundation sector, where we see some of our members for whom this is a really big priority. They're doing that by leading by example. So they're doing that good work and sharing that good work. And what I think is really powerful when they do that well is showing not just what is possible, but how it's possible, and being super transparent and open and generous around, well, this is exactly what we did. This is a step-by-step process. These are the templates that we used. Come on, help yourself to the tools and techniques that we used, so that you don't need to start from scratch on those. And that's a lot of what ACF facilitates in terms of showcasing case studies, providing top tips, having opportunities for peer learning, so that all that best practice can be shared widely amongst the sector. The second point I wanted to mention was around inclusion. And we held our annual chairs event last month, and the topic for that event was an inclusive board is an effective board. We really wanted to focus on inclusion because we felt it would speak to our member chairs wherever they are at the moment. We had a fantastic keynote speaker. Her name is Ange Handu. She happens to be on this call. And I think she's hosting another one of these events this evening. And I really like what she said at that event about the relationship between diversity and inclusion. I'm going to read you what she said. Having a board of trustees where members are drawn from a range of backgrounds and bring a diversity of thought and experience is important practice for stronger foundations. Diversity can substantially benefit boards, but it's not enough to ensure greater effectiveness. Building an inclusive culture which values fairness, respect, equality, dignity, and autonomy will help get the most out of any board, no matter its composition. And what I really like about emphasising inclusive culture for the board is that it's a highly practical place to start. There are things you can do tomorrow at no cost to make your board a more welcoming place for everyone and get the best from every member of the board. We heard lots of these suggestions at our chairs event, and without those inclusive practices, it doesn't actually matter how diverse your board is. Those less typical members won't stay, or you won't get the best from them. And I really welcome the fact there's been lots of comments today around inclusion, because it feels like it is an important way of moving the conversation on. And certainly we heard at our boards event, at our chairs event, a shift in the conversation from how do I get a diverse board to I have a more diverse board. How do I get agreement when we can't rely on consensus in the way that we used to when the board is less diverse? So actually embracing that sort of diversity of viewpoints. And it's really important to remember that the work is not finished when you have the right people around the table and not on the menu. And ensuring that inclusive culture is an ongoing job for the chair and for the board members, and that's going to change and evolve over time as the board grows and develops too. And then the final point I wanted to mention is picking up on, I think Paul mentioned, payment and expenses, and I suppose I kind of thought of this as a point around using expenses policy fully, but it's actually ensuring that trustees are reimbursed, and you use an expenses or reimbursement policy to ensure that that barrier does not exist. It's not a barrier to getting a diverse board. So at our chairs event, one of our chairs mentioned to me that he leads a funder that's focused on young people, and he said he really struggles with recruiting young trustees. That they're more likely to be doing the kind of work that where you take time out to attend a board meeting, you don't get paid for your day job. So there's guidance from the Charity Commission on reimbursing trustees for expenses. You could absolutely reimburse trustees for missing paid work to attend meetings at the rate that they would have been paid, not at a flat rate. For childcare, for a taxi home after evening meetings, those are all well within an expense policy. And of course, this is additional cost, but it's relatively little to an organisation, particularly when we talk about 4 board meetings a year. It removes that barrier for a lot of potential trustees. And there are exceptional circumstances where the Charity Commission will allow an organisation to pay for a trustee for being a trustee. So if there are significant barriers to recruiting trustees with specialist skills or perspectives that you feel your board needs, it's definitely worth exploring that possibility with the Charity Commission. I said I had 3 points, I've covered 3 points, but actually I have just remembered something else. So one of the things that our chairs gave us feedback on from the chairs event that they really valued was lots of very practical suggestions that our speakers made, things that they could go off and do tomorrow. So I wanted to mention a couple of these because I found them so valuable. The first is holding a drop-in session during a recruitment for people potentially interested to find out more. No commitment attached to it, just drop in, find out what being a trustee is all about. Board shadowing programs or board observer roles. Guys and St Thomas's Foundation do this, Smallwood Foundation do this, which Amber, I know you're a trustee there, so can probably say more about that. Using co-chairs and co-treasurers as a way of opening up opportunities. I'm a co-treasurer for an organisation. There's no way I would be a treasurer, but I will be a co-treasurer, so that opens some doors, making these roles co. Providing newer trustees with a mentor, but also thinking about reverse mentoring within a board. It's not necessarily the newer trustee that has the most to learn. The more experienced trustee has a lot to learn from having their eyes open through a new trustee. So that mentor relationship is not one way. We heard about building trust through time together and never underestimating the power of having a meal together as a board. Also a lovely suggestion around tricky topics that the board gets stuck on, or where there's a polarity of perspectives within the board, setting up a separate time, not to make decisions, but simply to share and listen to views without judgment. That the experience that some members had of doing that meant that then, when it was time for decision making, there was a much greater respect and understanding for within those different views. And Also making it plain you don't need trust and experience as a trustee to join the board, and using fixed terms as a lever as well to make changes. So ensure that you're opening up new opportunities. Sometimes you need people to move on to be able to open up those new opportunities, and using those fixed terms is a tool that boards have to hand.
Thank you, Catherine, for sharing that. That's been really helpful to recognise some of the good practice that really exists to try to create inclusive boards and boards that are attractive to a diverse group of people. I know this is a topic that came up when we met as a panellist ahead of this, so I don't know if other people want to sort of build on what Catherine said about that inclusive practice. Yes, you've got your diverse trustees, but what do you do with them? How do you make sure that they really have influence power, that they feel comfortable within that space? And while you do that, Leon, I don't know if there's any questions. I'm conscious that there might be some questions in the chat that we might want to pull out. So I'm just going to go to George first while you ever think about that, and then I'll come back to you, Leon. George.
Sure. So just a quick one in terms of how we can create that culture. So one of the organizations that we also fund at the Court Foundation is Action for Trustee Racial Diversity, and their focus is solely on increasing racial diversity on trustee boards, but they provide those necessary tools, toolkits, network specialist advice that people can essentially use, foundations can essentially use in order to understand how do we get these people and create more inclusive environment essentially for these people. So that's definitely one organization that I would recommend looking into in terms of Action for Trustee Racial Diversity. Another thing that I would say, building on Catherine's point, would actually be around, and it's probably just building on it more than anything, I think it's been mentioned, but I'll say in a different way. If you want to fund the unusual suspects, then you essentially need to have those unusual suspects in some way on your board or influencing your decisions, right? Unless it's going to be very difficult to find them. And one of my friends who was a trustee at BBC Children in Need said something to me that I'll never forget, and it was around a lot of young people are over-mentored and underfunded. So if we're trying to get these people to essentially take these roles and change the world, I think we're going to have to put some resources behind this as foundations in order to actually support them into these roles so that they can thrive. So yeah, that I think is very key. And I think Paul mentioned it in terms of funding, people potentially for disabilities or whatever it may be. I think doing more of that might be the way forward as well in terms of improving diversity on boards in general.
Thank you. And I know actually for Trustee Racial Diversity also have a database of a wide range of organisations that they can advertise roles through. So to move beyond your existing networks that if you don't know about, it's worth checking out. Leon, any key questions from the audience?
Mainly comments. There is a question from Paul Miles, which I think has gone unanswered, but it ties in with some of the other comments we've seen. So how focused can an advert be, bearing in mind diversification and inclusion? And there's a later comment that Jill has asked for, which is about diversity in Cornwall. Said it's really difficult to get diversity of ethnicity at board level, so we miss out on some funding due to our white boards, even though we have a 97% white population. So how can people target communities through their advertising, I guess it is the question. And for those where they serve a particular community where the board does in fact reflect the majority of the population, any thoughts on that?
Anyone want to pick that up?
Happy to jump in. On the advertising point, I think if you can be honest in your adverts, I think that's a really good starting point. So be honest about the data. So when it comes to disability, I think you can be very proactive. The legislation allows you to take positive action beyond just kind of saying you would particularly welcome applications. I think be honest about where you are as an organization, what you're looking for. And again, it comes back to that earlier point about actually what you might be looking for is a different voice and perspective. And if you can articulate that clearly, an advert doesn't have to get caught up in legal jargon. The more legalistic you try and make it, the more likely it will be challenged or someone will begin to question it. So start from a point of transparency. And just coming back to Jill's point, I mean, that's something we've tried to incorporate into our thinking at the Arts Council, just recognizing that diversity does look different across different parts of the country. And we need to recognize that in terms of some of our decision making. But also, I think the impact of the last 3 or 4 years, increasingly, we're all working remotely. There's increasing opportunities for trustees to come from a much wider geographic perspective in terms of adding perspective and insight. So I think there are ways of looking at that, but I would stress, I don't think any funder should penalize an organization recognizing some of those dynamics. But equally, I think it comes back to something Paul said earlier, which is also around the challenge for funders and foundations to kind of address the historic inequity in terms of distribution of funding. And that's something we do need to pick up on as well.
Thanks, Abid. Paul, I'm going to give you our last comment of the day, given time. So, Paul, over to you.
I mean, Catherine said, I think, some really important things about things like dinner, but I think chief execs have a really important role here, because one of the things that we do quite a lot of is buddying up new trustees. And I see the role of the chief exec as being really important to this. We do for all our new trustees, whoever they are, frankly, but particularly if you're from a different community. I run sessions with them before the board to talk through all the gobbledygook that we all use in boards to try to understand what it actually means, because people don't really understand what's going on often. But I think the critical bit for me is it can't be just one person. You've got to have a cohort and give it time. You know, the single individual on the board, it just doesn't work. For a properly diverse board doesn't have a person who happens to be black on the board. It will have a number of people who have very different views on it, who are a cohort. So actually, it dilutes that kind of white model of governance that I described earlier, because it's not there anymore, because there's a different dialogue. I mean, the other thing I think we ought to be thinking about doing is how we involve people beyond boards. Our panels now are majority people with lived experience, even though our board is a bit more diverse, not as diverse as perhaps it could be, but a bit more diverse than it was. So I think there's a way to think around that. The Cornwall question I'm very thoughtful of. I think one of the issues, particularly around race diversity, when we start to think about that, it creates an urban bias in our funding, and I'm very thoughtful on that, and poverty exists in rural areas too. But I think the message for funders ought to be, how do you properly represent the community in which you seek to serve? And if it's a working class community in Cornwall, then that's as relevant as a working class community in Birmingham or London that may well be majority black or Asian. So same question. But I do think there's a question for us as funders, because a lot of us now have created race equity programs or things with that name, and it does create an urban bias. We could say there's a reason for that, because that's where a lot of poverty and injustice is. But actually, there are poor parts of rural Britain too, and I completely recognise that. So I think that's something as funders we need to be very thoughtful about.
Thank you, Paul. It just remains me to thank George, Paul, Abid and Catherine for your contributions, and for everyone in the audience for your contributions in the chat and for listening. I won't say any more because I know that we're running out of time very quickly, so I'm going to hand back over to Leon to wrap up for us.
Thanks, Amberine. And I just wanted to take up the point that Kevin put in around LGBTQI plus people serving on boards. We have a session which Kevin will know about because he's chairing it on Friday, called Are Charities Heterosexist? So there's a real focus session on that. This afternoon, we have 2 more sessions that people can come to, and I am chairing one and running the other. So we've got Engaging Young People in Governance at 5 o'clock till 6, and then at 6:30 till 7:30 is What is a Trustee and How Do I Become One? So a sort of 1-hour masterclass on the role and bringing the role to life. If you know anybody that is an aspiring trustee but doesn't know where to start, that is the session to send them. So anyone in your team or in your network that you think would make a great trustee but is nervous about taking the first steps, then that's the session for them. And then we also have our networking session later on at 7:30, chaired by Ange, and she's put a couple of comments in the chat about that. Otherwise, that just leaves me to say thank you very much, everybody, for attending. In the chat function, I've included a link to an evaluation form, and you will get the recording of this just as soon as we're able to send it. So thanks very much, and have a nice afternoon.